Hi, everyone. Welcome to Dunlap at Home programming. Hi, Timaj. Hi, Soukayna.
Hi.
Welcome. So my name is Marina Fathalla. I'm a multidisciplinary artist and collective member of Mice magazine. Today, I have the pleasure of chatting with Timaj Garad and Soukayna. We're going to be talking about poetry, spoken word, community building. Welcome and thank you for spending time with us. Today's talk will be about 45 minutes. So note that there will be time for Q&A and you can post your questions in the chat and we'll be looking at them throughout the talk. So I'd just like to start by reading Soukayna and Timaj's bios. Soukayna is a multidisciplinary artist, curator, and writer with a background in film, art history, and French literature. Soukayna's work is largely motivated by the dichotomies of their identity as a queer Muslim Moroccan and aims to center marginalized voices and erased histories in their writing and artistic practice. In 2018, Soukayna published Words, a book of poetry based on their personal experience with home, longing, abuse, mental health, and healing. In addition to writing, Soukayna has given talks and lectures on alternative approaches to the art history canon with a specific interest for the African continent and has participated in multiple panels discussing identity and care work in the art world and beyond. They also act, model, direct, and enjoy researching topics related to history, visual studies, and psychology. Timaj is an Ethiopian, Harare, Toronto-based multidisciplinary storyteller, arts educator, and community organizer, using poetry, theater, and music to bring her stories to life. Her art is autobiographical, working at the intersections of a Black Muslim woman challenging injustice, unearthing truths, and healing. As an award-winning artist and educator, Timaj has graced over 300 stages and facilitated several arts-based workshops. Timaj is the founder of Luminous Fest, Canada's first Black Muslim arts festival, and co-founder of the Sisters Retreat, a retreat series hosting local and international arts-based wellness retreats for Muslim women. She is currently living in Toronto, sharing her poetry on stages across the province, continuing to organize art events, and working on her debut EP, Blooming at the Mouth, which will be released early next year. Timaj believes in the transformative power of the arts to build capacity and strengthen communities. Okay, welcome. I'd just like to read a land acknowledgement. I was born in Canada and my parents immigrated from Egypt in 1988. We're Coptic, which is a marginalized community in Egypt. The word means Egyptian and it's often associated with Coptic Christians. Although that seems to be the dominant narrative, Coptic is also an identity that I think moves beyond religion as one factor of our history. The first wave of immigration happened starting in 1962. At that time, there was rapid industrialization and nationalization under President Gamal Abdel Nasser's regime. When President Sadat governed between 1973 and 81, this coincided with the second wave of immigrants. Copts were politically and socially marginalized, discriminated against, and violence continues to this day. This was one factor for people to immigrate, but for my parents specifically, there were two reasons. The first is very similar to many immigrant narratives of opportunity and prosperity, looking for a future in their respective industries. And the second is due to a deep lack of human rights and lack of valuing human life based in experiences of trauma. So I grew up in Mississauga and lived alongside the Credit River on the ancestral territories of the Haudenosaunee, Atiwandarong, Anishinaabewaki, and Mississaugas of the New Credit. The Credit River marks the boundary of the former Credit Indian Reserve. So I'd like to just quickly mention how I came about both of your work and how I was really interested in inviting you to this conversation. So I met Timaj through a mutual friend and I just found your online presence and some of your posts really uplifting. And I find that I turn back to them a lot as a way of like referring back. And Soukayna and I met through a workshop that MICE was hosting. And the workshop was led by Geneviève Wallen and Ev Tajni. And Soukayna wrote a beautiful story about her grandfather, which really resonated. So I'd like to start the first question, which goes to both of you. What drew you to spoken word? Tell me about the first time you performed one of your pieces. What was the experience like, and how did it feel?
Okay, well, I guess I'll start. So the first time I performed one of my pieces was actually in high school, many moons ago. So it was sort of a mistake or by accident that I ended up falling into like a spoken word performance. I remember my grade 10 English teacher had told us, write a poem in a very and perform it in a creative way. Some people did like an interpretive dance, like other people rapped, some people sung it, whatever it is. And I thought, okay, I'm going to write a rap. So I wrote a rap. I was like really into hip hop at the time, still am. I wrote a rap, and these kids at the back were like, that was some really cool spoken word. I'm like, spoken what now? Talking about I was rapping. And it turned out that was spoken word and more of a spoken word format. And I was really intrigued by that because I'm like, so there's something else that's similar to rap that doesn't necessarily have to have music, that's in this kind of like melodic, poetic format. It was really new to me, all of 15 years old, not really having been introduced to the scene. But after that, I really kind of like was exposed to more of the art form. I would like binge watch Def Poetry Jam and things like that, as many of us did. And that was kind of my very first performance, but I was really always a performer first. Like I was into theater. I was always kind of like the star of the school play and things like that. So theater was, I guess, my first love, and then dance. And music, I guess, around the same time. And so writing was always a part of the process of being able to bring my lived experience into performance. So it's really like the performance that came first, which I think is like somewhat of a unique experience, because a lot of the time it's people are writing first and they're performing. Although I was always writing stories, I wasn't always writing spoken word or poetry. It was really just about, how do I bring stories into the public spaces that I want them to live in, because even from a very young age, I was really passionate about unearthing silences and telling stories that you don't often hear. I was really intrigued by the possibility in that. And so that's kind of how that journey started for me.
Wow, that is really amazing.
For me, we actually have very similar kind of backgrounds, I'm guessing, because I think spoken word came to me in some way as well. I also have a background in theater, and that was my first love in high school, actually. And I went to French school, so most of the books that I read or the text that I would write were mostly French. So I grew up with reading like the great French romantic classics, especially. I was obsessed with Baudelaire and Rimbaud, and the way that they write their proses was always very dramatic, but in a very performative way. So it always kind of like made a visual in my head of a performance. So for me, words were always kind of linked to acting in some way. And same, I think I binge watch all of Def Jam poetry as well. And I think specifically the author and poet Soher Hamad, who is a Palestinian poet, and who was her performance of Not Your Exotic, I believe, or Not Your Erotic, actually, was one of my favorite pieces ever. And I think when I saw that on YouTube, it just like really sparked even more. I always wrote since I was a kid, since even back when we immigrated here in Canada from Morocco. I remember I didn't even learn how to write or the alphabet yet, and it was just like doodle words or things like that and ask my mom, like, is this a sentence? And I think in high school, my French teacher came up to me because there was a slam spoken word competition, and she really enjoyed my writing. So she asked me to participate in it. So afterwards, it kind of just became a very loving relationship that I had with that aspect of writing. And I think, well, actually, my first performance was at a show called Take Care of Yourself, that was curated and organized by Sundus Abdulhadi, who's a very good friend of mine, an amazing artist. And we started talking, and she invited me to perform at her show. So it was in 2016, I believe, on Saint Laurent Street in Montreal. And the piece was called Odd to Myself. And that was my first time performing spoken word live. But I had performed theater and before.
Mm-hmm. You guys are both so outgoing. I like definitely write and enjoy and I feel like writing has started from a really young age, but I've never been drawn to performance. So but I love watching, and I'm so curious about that. So my next question is specific to your piece, Timaj, called Unfolding. So it's such a beautiful piece. It made me think of, speaking of performing as a way of presenting yourself into being, and how the voice has so much power, and just thinking about the impact of other people hearing you and witnessing you. So can you speak to the process of transformation and evolving in yourself, and how might the craft of poetry and performing help with that process of unfolding? And I was also curious about the workshops that you lead, and if that's something also that you kind of teach or encourage participants to explore in that way too.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed the piece. It's actually a piece that I've turned into a song, and it'll be on my upcoming EP next year. So Unfolding is really about resilience, but also thriving, trying to get to a place where we're thriving, and the work that it takes to actually be brave enough to be vulnerable, and vulnerable with ourselves first and foremost, to be able to, admit and acknowledge where we need to grow, but also kind of the idea of it's okay not to be okay, but we still have incredible capacity for healing as well. So just kind of a reminder to myself that there's everything that I kind of need is within me, and I can unfold that. So I think that when it comes to the imagery, unfolding, I'm talking about origami and this idea of unfolding a piece of paper, unfolding into your truest self, unfolding a story, and really understanding kind of what it is, what elements you can kind of bring out of yourself when you dare to kind of look beyond your comfort zone, and when you dare to become a seeker in your life. And so that's really what that piece is about. And in terms of transformation, it's just it's just recognizing the inner work. It's recognizing the inner kind of knowledge, and honoring your own wisdom and the knowledge that you carry, whether that's ancestral or what you've accumulated through experience, and giving yourself some credit at the end of the day, and in the context of a world that is constantly telling us otherwise. So the whole piece is contextualized. Like I say, I've been writing love poems these days in trenches of psychological wars, entrenched in the thirst for more. I've been writing in the silence of solitude to acknowledge you. And it's about almost unfolding love in an environment of lovelessness, or an environment that encourages us not to look for that, or to not seek it in our own authentic ways. So that's really what that piece is about. And you had another part to your question. I think I might have missed that part.
Oh, it's okay. You made me think of, I'm wondering if you've ever kind of surprised yourself in I guess it's like maybe if you start to put yourself out and seek, and then are you surprised by what happens, I guess, or yeah, I don't know, just something I was thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's like to get to the other question, the other part of the question is like that's what the journey of performing has been for me too, and the journey of sharing and being vulnerable. Because I think as artists, we're kind of in this position where we're like almost constantly vulnerable, you know. So that's an interesting space to navigate too as you're healing, because it does a couple of things. It makes the healing process, it kind of like it facilitates the healing process in some ways, and in some ways it also exposes you to a whole host of other things that you have to then manage, like what's that term I'm thinking of? I guess it's just like generally insecurity about, where the message will go or what the message means to people. Like you have to really fight with your ego too. So there's a lot of kind of like spiritual work for me that is done when I'm sharing and when I am taking on kind of a more public role with my art. So it kind of has that like two-tier effect on my life personally. And I think that just the process of creating is the process of unfolding, of exploring and discovering what you already have within you. And that can be really powerful and empowering, especially if you kind of dwell in that space often, if you have a consistent art practice. Like for me, that's what I love about being an artist, is the ability to also reimagine and understand what it is I actually hold, right? Because sometimes you don't really see that until you're in the process of creating, and then there's like these kind of, it's like the floodgates open, it's this catharsis, it's this discovery process, and a lot can come out of that, and it's just really beautiful to be able to like document that process of transformation as well, like throughout time.
Yeah, thank you. So I wanted to ask Soukayna about her piece, Things I Wish My Mother Told Me. So I'm going to read a quote from it. You wrote, do not talk without knowing. Do not open a door you already closed. Do not doubt your instincts. Do not be afraid of change. Do not project your insecurities onto others. So it kind of speaks to, I feel like, what we've been talking about in a way of like having that kind of intuition and understanding and trust in yourself that kind of comes within. So, and they also read as kind of reminders to yourself. And I was wondering if you could speak to the title and how you reflect on it as a kind of manifesto or wisdom.
Yeah, so that piece, I actually wrote it for a university class. So it was a class on manifestos in art history, and so we were visiting different art manifestos, different feminist manifestos, and more. And at the end, the prof, Maya Oppenheimer, who's an amazing prof at Concordia, asked us to write one as well. And so at that moment, it was written in 2017. And I believe that at that moment, I was in a very kind of rocky phase in my life, where I think I needed to kind of like, unfold as well a lot of my internal trauma and experiences. And the title came up because those things that I had to learn on my own, I wish basically my mother told me, so I didn't have to kind of process all of that alone. So it was kind of a manifesto in the sense. Also, I was very highly inspired by Jenny Holzer within her truism, which was very short, kind of like manifest or like statements about herself in different situations, different kind of emotions, and navigating them. And I think it is a reminder that I set for myself, and that surprisingly or not surprisingly actually touched a lot of people when it was shared, it was actually my prof in question actually had it printed out and put in her office. So it was very sweet, and I think it just comes. All those truisms came with different experiences I had, whether it is, as you said, do not open a door that you've already closed, in the sense that when you come from an abuse a past, that is a bit abusive, and you kind of like get out of it. There are things like that where you don't need to look back at. And I think it's mostly reminders that I wish someone else, such as a maternal figure, would have said to me, but that I had to learn on my own, which is, in hindsight, very good as well. But yeah, they speak, and they're still very relevant. Sometimes I go and read that manifesto again, just when I'm feeling in kind of like weird spaces and I'm not sure about certain things. And it really feels basically like guidelines for me to follow in some way as a protection for myself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just want to say that's so amazing that your prof put it on the wall. That's so validated and beautiful. That's so nice. Yeah. I actually, you reminded me of like, sometimes if you're going through like a period of anxiety and you like reflect on it when you're feeling better and write all the things that you want to remember the next time things come up, and like in that moment it's hard to kind of like put those things together, and it's so much it helps to have something kind of there to refer to.
Yeah, I try to write down whenever I feel really good about myself or something, or a day or anything, or just like general statements when I'm in a good place that I can look back at in those days where it's a bit more difficult, kind of, as you said, like a reminder from past happy me to possibly future kind of less happy.
Yeah. To that, I wanted to ask you about how you navigate the line between like being vulnerable and sharing really personal stories, and like opening yourself up or kind of reflecting or unfolding in a public way.
For me, it was very, very difficult at first. I think Timaj kind of mentioned it at the beginning. When you're, as the writer, creator, you feel like you're always very vulnerable, right? So it's very true, and especially when most of your work is very personal or autobiographical, you need to make it very clear where the boundary is between what of yourself you share and where you kind of keep to yourself. And vulnerability has always, for a long time, been one of my biggest fears, actually, where I was not able to share anything about myself for very different reasons. And I think when they say there's strength in vulnerability, it is very true, but they don't tell you how difficult it is to also kind of like tap into it and just let yourself get in it. So for a long time, it was a learning process to allow myself to get into my feelings, to allow myself to be a bit more vulnerable. And when I did, it was great because a lot of people reached out to me in the sense that they felt similar ways, or that they could find themselves in my writing or in my experiences, and they were happy that I was sharing that. Because it's very human, right? But at the same time, it's very difficult because I feel like when you're publicly vulnerable, people think that makes you accessible as well. And so that's where the fine line is, where at some point, like in the last month, I had to kind of like retract myself a bit to protect my own kind of like personal energy and whatnot. Because I do love the fact that people can relate and that they don't feel as alone. But sometimes there are lines that are crossed or put me in a very awkward situation. People would kind of send me messages with very, very deep personal stuff, which I'm very grateful for the trust, but that I don't have the energy or place really to put on my plate. So it's been a huge learning lesson. I'm still kind of learning, to be honest. I think I still allow some parts of myself to be very public, but where I think I draw my line, I'm getting better at that and applying it a bit more and sharing also what I feel like sharing without having to overthink it, but also making sure that my lines are more firm and into place. So I think there's no perfect way to do it, is what I'm trying to say. I think it's very personal. So I'm sure Timaj has her personal experience also with that. Like,
Yeah, that's definitely something that I think I was trying to also articulate, but you said it so beautifully, Soukayna, is like the access, the level of access that people feel that they have to you sometimes is overwhelming, even after a show, and you kind of just want to decompress or, you know, have conversations about your work, but not like conversations that are therapeutic conversations with strangers, right? Which can sometimes be you sometimes have the capacity and sometimes not, but either way, it's difficult to take that role on by default when that's the expectation. So yeah, thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, it definitely beats that you're really like accessible and your work resonates with people. And I think there is that sometimes when people have like even like an online presence that's really personal, then you feel like you personally know them. And yeah, I can definitely see that.
I've had a friend of mine call me the Instagram psychologist. That's I was like, oh God, no, I can't be that person.
I wanted to ask you, Timaj, about piece in both like unfolding and things we didn't say on the train. I noticed a way of looking inward at the body and kind of like referencing bodily material, teeth, mouth, the blood. And as a listener, I really felt that in my body. And there's, as I mentioned, like there's something about what's spoken that's different than reading. So you also connected these bodily feelings to kind of broader the universe, moon, the sun, the stars. So I was wondering if you could speak to what that relationship means to you between like your body and the universe.
Yeah, well, that's a really beautiful way to put it. So thank you for that reflection. I'm like, is that poem that deep? No, but you're obviously a really deep thinker, Marina. So thanks for sharing. I feel like that piece specifically, just to give it context, because I think it means different things for different people, and that's totally okay. But for me, it was about anxiety and depression, and kind of feeling stuck in my body a lot of the times, and feeling, you know, like there are days when my body is sort of like conspiring against me, like whether it's like the anxiety or the pain that I'm feeling or whatever it is. And so it's a way of kind of addressing the emotionality and like really using the body as a grounding metaphor to describe some of those feelings that sometimes are really hard to describe, you know, that for me, it goes beyond just experience, and it's more about just the feeling of not necessarily being able to move beyond a particular state, right? So the train is like, the metaphor is that I'm on this train and it's kind of going back and forth. I start by saying I rode the train six times today from one terminal station to another. And so it's this like kind of constant, I go one place and I go another place just to return back to where I was, right? So it's this, I'm in motion, but I'm not really like arriving. It's that feeling of that journey that doesn't really feel like it has much of a destination or is even much of a journey, because it's so cyclical, right? And then the piece about the body is that I'm asking my body to help me to ground myself. So that's what that's about. But there's also in the way, and this is sometimes like I feel like what I feel about certain lines or pieces kind of evolves throughout time. But for me, when I perform that piece, it's also about searching for expansion, right? So when you think about the universe, for example, the universe is expanding, I think, faster than the speed of light, and it's consistently expanding in that direction. It's becoming more of itself. And so I think it's just this idea of like the desire to expand beyond certain circumstances or certain states of being and really start to like become, right? So a lot of my work kind of has those central themes of like becoming and overcoming and searching, right? So that piece is also about like pulling from what I can see that has the qualities that I want to embody, of like expansion of the universe, like the brilliance of a star, the shine, the luminosity, the grandness, but also the humility of being just like a celestial body in the universe, right? And this consistently expanding thing that, yes, we're important, but we're not like the most important thing. And there's like beauty in that, the balance between humility and also acknowledging like our luminosity, acknowledging our strength and our capacity to continuously expand and become different, right? To evolve with whatever direction we may desire to evolve. So it's really just like kind of like a love poem to myself in terms of addressing those feelings and then addressing what I want from myself and for myself.
It's so beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really relatable in terms of like going back to the body to ground yourself in moments of anxiety, and then like humility. Like I really read that really resonates. Also, just kind of like a reminder where we stand. And, yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's a hard thing because people feel. I think sometimes we look at because when you think about expansion and also like contraction, like humility feels like a contraction, but it is a sort of expansion. And then when you think of like grandiosity and then being small, but being small in a way that you're just acknowledging that there's so much more than what you can see, what you feel. I think we think of those things as polar opposites, and we think that we can embody both of those feelings at once. But I think for me, part of the journey of healing is being able to do that, right? To love yourself, but not center yourself in everything, which is, I think, a really important thing. And I think that sometimes the conversation on self-love and self-care ventures a little bit too far away from community, and it centers the self, it commodifies. It really is about consumption a lot of the times more than it is about collective empowerment or moving towards a state where we are important and we acknowledge who we authentically are, but we're also making space for others to exist around us in a way that feels safe and good to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that relates to another question that I had about community building, because I have been in contexts where kind of like in an interview context and talking about community or what community means for me. And sometimes there's terminology around it, like mutual aid, and just like kind of like taking it back and realizing that it's something that's like kind of ingrained in how I grew up, and it's something that's just like sort of more like automatic, I guess. And so I was wondering if either of you guys could speak to kind of like things that you grew up around or family models that that just become part of your values, and the way that you see what community care means.
For me, I think when it comes to community or how it was, you're asking basically some of our values or thoughts around community came from maybe our family or anything related to that, right? Just so.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
For me, a lot of some of my biggest values obviously are community, but it goes outside of, as you said, I think she mentioned that basically self-care isn't just very individual. It's a thing about community, about helping your neighbor, the person next to you, whoever kind of needs help. And I think that's something that was taught to me at a very early age, I like to think, from my grandparents. So I actually grew up in Morocco before my family moved here. And I remember my grandma is a kind of old woman who every time we would go outside or like wait for a train to go somewhere, she would always pack sandwiches in the bag. So for every single one of us. So my sister, my mom, her daughter, and everyone who would go on the trip. But she would also always pack like 2 or 3 extra sandwiches to give to people who were in the streets. So it's just something that was very natural to her to do that. Or when we would walk around and Morocco is a very poor country. So whenever we would walk around and people were asking for money, she always had a little pouch with some kind of change or money to give specifically to those people. So that kind of care and just love for wanting to help is something that I believe has been passed to me through my grandma, but also my grandfather. So he recently passed away, and he is someone who had a very, very big passion for the arts in general and always community. And he was always working towards making life better for his daughter, so my mom. Even though she's a woman, and we lived in a Muslim country or whatnot, he was always very prominent on her finishing her studies, going on about her career and being independent. And so those kind of values of self-care, but self-worth also, and kind of working towards your goal, not only for yourself, but for the people around you as well, are something that I have seen around me growing up, and even coming here, meeting other people who had certain very similar values and working with them to kind of like make sure that other people have what they need or the visibility that they should have. So I think my family has been really great at basically transmitting that love and care. I think it comes also from sadaqa, which is basically kind of to give back in general, and just kind of like this very ingrained generosity. So it's something that's very cultural, I believe, but also something that if I look at it from an individual point of view, from where I was raised and how it happened, it's something that I was lucky enough to have and absorb around me.
I guess to answer your question, very similar in terms of, I guess, how we were raised with the idea of like sadaqa. I'm also Muslim, and the idea of the fact that it's important to, if you have, to give of what you have for people that require support. But also in the Hari Ethiopian tradition, we have a concept called Afocha, which is basically a community organization. It's like something that, if you have the means, you would pay kind of a membership fee to be a part of. And that fee is sort of like a community safety net. And this is something that supports you, if someone in the community is in need, that fee goes towards things like supporting a family who lost a loved one for funeral costs and things like that. So it sounds a little morbid to say, but like my funeral's already like paid off through this like community fund. But I think it's incredible that like, this is a group of people that we immigrated separately, but we somehow found that common thread and built community together in this like new place, with all of our baggage and traumas. And we were able to create this like really effective and efficient kind of community economic system, right, internally for our community. And in that same light, there are groups that there are different organizations within the organization, groups of friends that have different fundraising efforts put towards raising money for different causes and helping out community members back home and also here that are struggling. So I think that, you know, my family has really, and my community to extend that, has really kind of taught me that it's important to take care of each other, not just as a response, but as a continuous act of loving and caregiving, and that it's actually not, you know, it's our responsibility, if we have the capacity to do so, to provide that type of support. And I was thinking about this the other day, that, you know, in this situation, people are checking in with each other, and it's really kind of ingrained in our culture to check in, to, you know, if someone gives birth, family members visit and stay with the parents for 40 days. Like, it's really kind of a system where it's very normalized to check in. It's not seen as an imposition. People are not continuously asking if it's okay. And although, like, yes, checking in and getting consent is important, I think to some degree there's almost like and I guess like a Western framework or society, there's almost this idea of like, I'm not a part of you. I'm not a part of your family, or I'm not a part of your community necessarily. So I don't actually have to do this. And if I do it, it's a kindness. Whereas in our family, in our tradition, it's seen as a social responsibility. It's seen as like, you are a part of that person, and you are required to show up when you can, and with whatever you can, right? So I think that that's really beautiful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so beautiful. And yeah, I was thinking about that in relation to like how it's kind of intertwined with your like identity and how you see yourself as not like individualistic, you know, like the way that you describe yourself is more like in relation to other people. And I'm just, yeah, I'm finding that it's a lot, that like the most engaging thing for me is to like envision every kind of like every project or everything that I do as something that's like about learning with other people and collaboration.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I don't know if we have time for one more question, or if I so well, up to you. Okay. So I guess you kind of answered this, Timaj, but a little bit. But I wanted to point to the what resonated with me about your 10 lessons of the decade that you posted. So you said if a space or community you want to be a part of doesn't exist, create it if it's in you to do so. So that like really resonated, and I feel like over a few months I can look back and say like, oh, I think that's kind of filtered in different ways. So I was wondering if you can speak about how you've shaped and developed, like if you developing a community in Toronto, was it in response to a gap or like something that you didn't see? And yeah, if you could speak to that.
Yeah, I think that it's sort of always, whenever I've created a community series, or even my festival, Luminous Fest, it's always because there is a gap, or just a gaping chasm in what the community or communities that I belong to are offering. And I think that it's not necessarily only as a response, but it's really just as a desire to see people in communities that I belong to, that are not represented or not seeing themselves, or sometimes people don't show up because they don't feel comfortable to. And how do you actually even like start the conversation of building community if there are no spaces where people actually feel comfortable that they can go to? So I really am passionate about using the arts to create spaces, and to curate spaces, but also to create spaces and where people feel like they can start to kind of explore themselves, flourish, build authentic community. And like, I'm really proud of some of the work that I've done that's allowed people to really connect with each other. Like it's, you know, if you make art, great. But if you make a friend, like, I feel like that's more so what I care about sometimes, more than the art. The art is like really just a tool, but if you're able to like, you know, feel a little bit more welcome in a space, or you feel seen, you feel like you've been able to connect with people, I think that's what I'm more so kind of focused on when I'm building or creating spaces. And one space that I can think of, there are many spaces, but one space that I can think of where that's kind of manifested in a big way is again the festival, Luminous Fest, which is a Black Muslim arts festival. At the time, I actually thought of this idea back in like 2016. It didn't materialize until 2018, but I thought of it as like, okay, well, we don't actually have any spaces for Black Muslims. The conversation now, there's way more of a conversation about Black Muslims, but and our experiences, but there wasn't really at the time, and there weren't any spaces, let alone like art spaces. There were very few spaces in general where we could actually address the erasure of Black Muslims in the Muslim community, but also society at large, right? It really felt like this, like we're constantly having to like, you know, fragment ourselves and not really feel like we can show up as our full selves. So I created Luminous Fest as like a space of joy to celebrate community, to celebrate ourselves, a space where we don't always have to always show up with our trauma, you know, which is sometimes what happens when you have a particular identity. It's like, oh yeah, can you talk about that? Like, we want you to be on the panel to talk about this. And although, you know, I'll take those gigs too. I still feel like it's important to have a space where it's like, no, talk about like, you know, your first love, talk about like, play this guitar to like this random song that like doesn't mean anything particularly heavy or whatever it is, just lighthearted. Like, who cares? Just be yourself, just exist in space with each other and witness each other. And if others want to be a part of that space as you know, allies or a witness to what we create for ourselves, and that's beautiful and that's welcome. But primarily it's a space to be able to be seen and to be heard, because I think like that's really kind of where that transformation can begin at a community level.
Yeah, I think there's I feel like in my experience, just like looking for a community to be a part of, and sort of like having so many instances where you kind of tack yourself on, and it's like, that's not quite it, but I think this is the closest to where I feel comfortable for the moment. And so yeah, I think that's really important. And in a way, like it just asks for us to sort of like take the lead, and that's just like kind of what's required into like, just like to feel empowered to take that step. I'm wondering if there was any like challenges along the way in creating that space for yourself and for other people.
Yeah, I think the main challenge is, you know, interestingly enough, it wasn't that challenging to get funded, because it was such a different space. And I think that there was kind of like an intrigue about it, like, oh, Black Muslims, okay, you know, like there was that kind of a vibe. So it wasn't that but it was kind of like, interestingly enough, hard to explain that intersection to certain people, and that just like, you know, kind of exposed the erasure and how intensive it was, because I would like, at first I would like go to different community spaces. It was in the beginning an Eid event. So during Ramadan, it was Eid al-Fitr. So during Ramadan, I would go to like different community gatherings and things like that to promote with my flyers and that sort of thing. Back when people were handing out flyers to each other, and, you know, and not panicking about it. But I would hand out my flyers and people would be like, what is this? Like, why is it just for Black Muslims? I'm like, well, we're the performers and the vendors, but we're not necessarily like, you can come, right? And there was a lot of like conflict around that. There was a lot of people that didn't feel that we needed a space, and there's kind of this like, people would say things like, oh, well, like that's the Muslim community, there should be united, and why do you feel like you need to like branch out and do your own thing? So this idea of a third space or an alternative space and how healing that can be was something that I had to sort of explain to people, which was a little exhausting, but you know, I had the capacity for it and I took it on. And I think that is something that was really difficult in terms of being able to bridge that gap. But at the end of the day, and I never had to explain this to Black Muslims, I only had to explain it to people without that identity.
Yeah.
Like, Black Muslims got it. They're like, girl, like, I'm there. This is so necessary. Like, where has this been? You know, and it almost felt like everyone else was like, either like, Black Muslims, huh? Or they were like, I don't get it. Like, what do you mean? So, yeah, that was interesting. But I feel like as time has gone on, like so much can change in just a few years. I think this conversation has really like erupted, and I'm not saying that the work is done and we don't have so much more to do in terms of addressing anti-Blackness within anti-Black Islamophobic racism, I should say, in our communities. There definitely is a lot that's still there to address, but there is this familiarity with it now, with the conversation, which I think is really important. So I think that that's what happens when you see spaces that don't exist and you create them, is that, yes, it might be challenging. You might get some pushback, and change is not going to happen overnight. But even having that visibility and being able to start a conversation is a start, you know? And when I say if it's in you to create, is that we don't have to create these spaces. We really don't. We can also just exist and, you know, be cute and binge Netflix and read our books and drink tea. And that's totally fine too. That's 100% fine. I don't like this idea of like kind of toxic productivity where, you know, we feel like it's our responsibility to educate people and to like be the change. Like, if you have that in you, then great, but that is not our responsibility if we don't have the capacity for it, because it is true that the discrimination we experience, it affects us, and trauma, you know, can really have that effect where you may not feel like you have the capacity, and that's okay to just focus on your self, right? Healing yourself is also a radical act of community building, right? So I think that's part of what I mean by if you have it in you.
Yeah, that's kind of how I read it too, like that, like mental capacity is also a factor, and that you know, like that it's valid to check in with yourself and see if that's something that you're able to do. Yeah. Okay, so been told we're out of time. I feel like I have so much more to ask, but I want to say thank you so much for spending this time with me. It was so nice talking to you guys. Honestly, it felt like 1 minute.
I know. I feel like we just started talking.
Yeah. And yeah, I want to mention that Soukayna is going to do an Instagram takeover in the next 3 days.
Yeah, so from tomorrow till Sunday.
Yeah.
Yeah. 4 days.
Yes. Dunlap's Instagram page. And yeah, I just wanted to thank Dunlap Art Gallery and Sarah and Alyssa Fearon. Yes, I don't know if there's anything else to add before we go.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, this has been really beautiful. Thank you for having us. I guess I'll just plug myself quickly before we go. I have an EP dropping next year. It's called Blooming at the Mouth. I'm also a singer-songwriter, so you'll get it's music basically. But I do add a lot of my poetry in my music. So that's going to be happening. It's actually already done. I know my bio says I'm working on it, but I'm done. I guess I'm working on promoting it, hence this. So it'll be next year, probably end of January. And you can follow me at Timaj Garad, TIMAJGARAD, on Instagram to check that out. And thank you so much for holding this space. It's been beautiful.
Amazing. Thank you. Thanks so much.
Yeah. And for me, well, as of tomorrow, I'll be talking about a bit more of my work, and I'll plug myself a bit more tomorrow. So
Looking forward to it. Thank you, guys. All
Thank
right.
you.
bye.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye.